It was a quiet afternoon on the highway, the kind where the sun seems to hang low in the sky, casting long shadows over the road. Most drivers are just focused on the endless stretch ahead, the hum of their vehicles becoming almost a background noise. But for one truck driver, that peaceful routine was about to be shattered by a sight that would forever change his life. Imagine you're driving down an empty road, minding your own business, when you spot something that makes you slams on the brakes. That's exactly what happened to Ryan, a seasoned trucker, as he cruised down a remote stretch of highway. Out of nowhere, his eyes caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong, a dog, alone, stranded. It was lying in the middle of the road, its body trembling with fear, and it looked like it had been there for hours. Ryan had seen a lot in his time on the road. Broken down cars, stranded vehicles, and even the occasional wild animal. But this was different. He could feel his heart race as he pulled over to the side of the road. The dog didn't run away. It stayed there, helpless and waiting. As he stepped out of his truck, Ryan's thoughts raced. Was it lost? Was it hurt? There was no way he could just drive past and do nothing. But what happened next wasn't something Ryan ever could have predicted. As he approached the dog, something about its eyes told him this wasn't just any encounter. It was a moment that was about to change his life forever. What started as a simple act of kindness would turn into a story he'd tell for years to come. But how would this dog, stranded on the side of the road, alter Ryan's life in ways he never expected? Ryan bent down cautiously, not knowing whether the dog would lash out in fear or accept his help. The tension in the air was thick. With every step closer, the weight of the decision felt heavier. Could he really make a difference for this animal? And what would it mean for him if he did? As Ryan knelt beside the dog, he didn't realize it yet, but the path his life was about to take would be far more complicated than he could ever imagine. The next few moments would set the stage for a journey filled with unexpected twists, challenges, and a bond that would define the rest of his days. But at that moment, with the dog's warm eyes looking up at him in a way that seemed to speak volumes, all Ryan knew was that he couldn't turn away. Stay with us to find out what happens next. You won't believe the incredible turn this story takes. Ryan's mind was racing as he slowly reached out his hand toward the trembling dog. He could see the scrapes on its fur, the dried dirt caked around its paws. It was clear the dog had been through something. Maybe it had been wandering for days, or maybe it had been abandoned. Whatever the case, it was in need of help, and Ryan knew he couldn't just leave it there. But as much as he wanted to offer some comfort, there was an underlying feeling in his gut that kept him on edge. He wasn't a vet. He wasn't a dog rescuer. He was just a truck driver trying to get from point A to point B. And yet, something about this moment felt so much bigger than the road or his route. His instincts kicked in, telling him to help. But there was a quiet voice in the back of his head, questioning if he was even qualified to do so. The dog let out a low whimper, and Ryan paused. He could see the weariness in its eyes, but there was also something else. A sense of trust, as if the animal knew that Ryan was the only one who might offer it any kind of safety. That made his decision easier. He couldn't walk away now. But as Ryan carefully approached the dog, he realized there was one major complication. The animal didn't look like it was alone. In the distance, almost hidden behind a cluster of bushes, Ryan saw a small rundown shack. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't noticed it earlier, but now that his focus was on the dog, the odd structure caught his attention. His eyes narrowed. There was a faint smell of something burning in the air, a scent of desperation. Could someone have been living there? And if so, why was the dog out here, alone? Ryan's first instinct was to walk toward the shack, but something held him back. He glanced down at the dog. Its eyes locked onto his every move. It was almost as if it was warning him to stay, away. But Ryan couldn't ignore the unease creeping up his spine. He took a step back and surveyed the situation. The shack wasn't far off, and he could see faint movement behind one of the windows, the silhouette of someone watching. It sent a chill down his spine. Something didn't sit right. Should he investigate the shack? Should he call animal services? Or should he take the dog with him and get it checked out as quickly as possible? The problem was, Ryan had been on the road for hours. His truck was loaded down, and he couldn't afford to waste too much time. He had a deadline to meet, but leaving the dog here, especially with someone watching from the shack, felt wrong. Just as Ryan was about to make up his mind, the dog let out a soft bark, pulling him back to reality. Ryan knelt down, reaching out, with a calming voice. "Hey, it's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog flinched at first, but then inched closer, its tail wagging ever so slightly. Ryan's heart softened. He carefully reached out and touched the dog's head, relieved when it didn't pull away. It was almost as if the dog was saying, "Help me." In that moment, the decision was made. Ryan gently guided the dog toward his truck, his mind racing. What had happened here? Why had the dog been left behind? And why did it seem so connected to that shack? He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than just a stray animal in need of help. As Ryan prepared to load the dog into his truck, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the shack. His heart raced. Again, he turned, expecting to see someone emerge from the small building. But when he saw the figure step into view, he froze. A man, tall and ragged-looking, walked slowly toward him. His eyes locked onto Ryan's with an intensity that made Ryan's skin crawl. The man didn't say anything at first. He just stared, his face weathered and tired. But there was something in his gaze that sent a chill down Ryan's spine. Something that made it clear this wasn't just a simple encounter. Ryan stood up straight, trying to act casual, but feeling the tension in his chest rise. I was just helping the dog. It looks like it's been abandoned." The man's lips curled into a half smile, but it wasn't reassuring. "You don't know anything about this dog," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, and there was an unsettling edge to it. Ryan's pulse quickened. "I'm just trying to do the right thing. The dog was in the middle of the road. It needs help." For a moment, there was a long silence between them. The man's eyes didn't leave Ryan's, and it felt like a weight was pressing down on Ryan's chest. He could feel the air grow colder, and the feeling that something was terribly off intensified. "Maybe it's you who needs help," the man finally said, his tone cryptic and strange. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the shack, disappearing into the shadows. Ryan stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The dog, now by his truck, barked once, almost as if urging him to move. But Ryan couldn't. Shake the feeling that something was very wrong. That man, who was he? What was his connection to the dog? And why had he spoken in such an unsettling way? Ryan glanced at the dog one more time. It was looking up at him, trusting him. There was no going back now. But he knew he had to be careful. The road ahead was no longer just about helping an abandoned animal. Something deeper was at play, and Ryan had no idea how much this moment would turn his world upside down. Stay tuned, because what happens next is something Ryan never saw coming. Ryan stood there for a long moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. His instincts told him to get in his truck and drive, to just forget about the strange man and the uneasy feeling that was growing in his chest. But the dog was still there, looking up at him with those sad, trusting eyes. He couldn't just leave it now. Not after everything. With a deep breath, Ryan climbed into the cab, the dog following him like it had already claimed its place. As he started the engine and pulled back onto the road, his mind couldn't help but race. Who was that man? Why was he so protective of the dog? And what had made him act the way he did? But as Ryan drove farther down the highway, the answers he was searching for came much faster than he anticipated. A few miles down the road, Ryan saw flashing lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought it was just a coincidence, maybe another driver needing assistance. But when the sirens grew louder, he realized it was a police car. His heart sank. He had nothing to hide, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were taking a strange turn. He pulled over, trying to steady his nerves. A police officer stepped out of the car, approaching Ryan's truck with a cautious demeanor. The officer didn't waste any time. "Sir, we've had reports of a missing dog in this area. Have you seen one? Or, picked one up?" Ryan's pulse quickened. "I found this dog a few miles back. It was stranded in the middle of the road. I was just trying to help it." The officer looked at the dog, his eyes narrowing. "That's unusual," he said slowly. "This dog was reported missing weeks ago, but we have reason to believe it's tied to something much bigger. We've been looking for it for a long time. I have to ask you to come with us." Ryan's mind reeled. What did the dog have to do with anything? Why was it so important to the authorities? Before he could process it fully, the officer continued, "There's something you need to know. This dog belongs to a woman who's been involved in some pretty dangerous activities. We've been tracking her for months, but she always managed to stay one step ahead. It looks like this dog was left behind as a message." Ryan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The dog, which had seemed so innocent, was caught up in something far beyond his understanding. It wasn't just a stray. It was a key to a much bigger mystery. The shack. The strange man. All of it was starting to make sense, but not in any way Ryan could have predicted. The officer explained that the woman who owned the dog had been suspected of illegal activity, and the dog was her only known connection. She was dangerous, and they believed she had abandoned the animal when she realized she was being tracked. The strange man from the shack was likely working with her, trying to retrieve the dog before anyone else could find it. Ryan's head spun as the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about helping a lost dog anymore. It was about getting involved in something much bigger, something he never wanted to be a part of. But now he had a choice to make. He could walk away, let the authorities handle it, and forget this whole ordeal. Or he could stay, help uncover the truth, and risk becoming entangled in a dangerous situation. He glanced at the dog, now curled up on the seat beside him, its eyes soft and trusting. Whatever this dog had been through, it had brought him here for a reason, and despite the fear crawling up his spine, Ryan knew he couldn't just turn his back now. "I'll come with you," Ryan said, his voice steady, despite the chaos in his head. The officer nodded, clearly relieved that Ryan was on their side. They both climbed into the police car, and as they drove back toward the location where Ryan had found the dog, he couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't the end of the story. This was just the beginning. They arrived at the shack, the place where everything had started. The officer approached cautiously, his hand on his gun, as Ryan stayed in the car with the dog. In the distance, the silhouette of the strange man was standing in the doorway, his eyes locked onto the police car. There was no way out now. The game was up. The officer approached the man, who didn't resist. The confrontation was over before it even began. As the police took him into custody, Ryan sat in silence, trying to process the whirlwind of events. The dog, now safe in the hands of authorities, had been the missing piece to a much larger puzzle, and Ryan had unwittingly become part of it. But as Ryan watched the police drive away with the man and the dog, something inside him shifted. He realized that, for all the danger and uncertainty, he had made the right choice. He had helped, not just a dog, but a living being who was counting on him in its moment of need. And sometimes, that's all we can do in this world. Step up when we can, even when we don't fully understand the consequences. As Ryan continued his journey down the highway, he thought about how much this experience had changed him. What had begun as a routine day on the road had turned into an adventure that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He may never fully understand the depths of the situation, but one thing was certain. It had been a turning point, and sometimes, even the smallest acts of kindness can lead to something far greater than we ever imagined. The road ahead stretched out before him, and Ryan knew that no matter what came next, he'd never look at life, or the unexpected moments that shape it, the same way again.